Now we're going to start the dural fold and dural venous sinus. Now we're going to draw the line diagram and then we can see the dural fold. Now this is the skull. See, the point is the cranial dura is having two layers, the endosteal layer and meningeal layer, whereas spinal dura is having only single layer. Okay, so now this is the skull. So we are drawing the cranial dura. I told you the cranial dura is having two layers. Now the one which is close to bone, that is called endosteal layer of the dura. And next one, this is the meningeal layer of the dura. The meningeal layer of the dura which go into the brain and they form the dural fold like this. So this is our meningeal layer of the dura. The meningeal layer of the dura which goes inside the brain and in turn forms dural fold. So dural fold is coming from the meningeal layer of the dura. Okay, right. See the diagram. Now between the two layers of dura, we have a space. So spaces are called sinus. So this space is called dural sinus. So what is dural sinus? Dural sinus is the space between the two layers of dura and that is filled with the blood. What type of blood? Venous blood. So this space is called dural venous sinus. So what is dural venous sinus? It is a space between the two layers of dura which contain the venous blood. Okay. Again, sometimes, yes, the dural venous sinus may also present here also. In the meningeal layer of dura also, you may have dural venous sinus. Okay, right. So now, first we're going to discuss about the dural folds and we're going to list out all the dural venous sinus and we're going to discuss about the cavernous sinus in detail. Okay. Now, dural fold. Now, see the diagram. Now, this is a cadaveric image, yes, and we are seeing falx cerebri. See, falx cerebri is a dural fold which is present between the two cerebrum. So, please write falx cerebri. It is a dural fold which is present between the two cerebrum. Okay. Now, what are the contents of the falx cerebri? See, falx cerebri in the dural folds, I told you, yes. Now, in the dural folds, you have between the dural folds, you have dural venous sinus. Now, what are the dural venous sinuses present in the falx cerebri? Now, above you have superior sagittal sinus. Similarly, below inferior sagittal sinus, and which in turn continue as straight sinus. This is number 1, this is number 2, and this is number 3. So these three sinuses present in the falx cerebri. What are those? Superior sagittal sinus, superior sagittal sinus. Number 2, inferior sagittal sinus. And number 3, straight sinus. Number 3, straight sinus. Okay. Next, dural fold, tentorium cerebelli. Next dural fold, second dural fold is tentorium cerebelli. See, tentorium cerebelli, the name itself, you have a clue. It is like a tent. Okay, between. So below you are seeing cerebellum. So above cerebrum you see. So tentorium cerebelli, it is a dural fold which is present between cerebrum and cerebellum. Present between cerebellum and cerebrum. Okay. Next, what are the contents? The contents are which contains. Can you see the bone here? There is a petrous temporal bone will be here. So here is our petrous temporal bone. The petrous temporal bone. Now above we have a sinus, dural venous sinus, superior petrosal sinus here like this, and superior petrosal sinus will be here like this. Okay, and here you have the lateral sinus. Lateral sinus will be like this, and here the straight sinus. Actually, we removed the falx cerebri, so straight sinus will be here like this. So three sinuses present. Okay, so tentorium cerebelli contains. This is number one. That is our superior petrosal sinus. Superior petrosal sinus. Okay. Number two, transverse sinus. Transverse sinus. And number three, straight sinus. Okay. So here the tentorium cerebelli contains superior petrosal sinus, transverse sinus, and straight sinus. Okay. Right. Next, see the diagram. Now in this diagram, yes, this is the falx cerebri, the dural fold, which contains this one, superior sagittal sinus. So this is inferior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, and this is straight sinus. Okay, right. Now can you see the dural fold here? That is present in the same way like a falx cerebri. What the falx cerebri will do? It's present between the two cerebrum. Similarly, this is falx cerebelli. The dural fold is called falx cerebelli, and this is the third dural fold we are seeing. So first I told you falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, and third is the falx cerebelli that is present between the two cerebellum. Now can you see one blue color there? So one venous sinus is present there. What is that? Occipital sinus. So occipital sinus is present in the falx cerebelli. Right. And one last one, that is the diaphragma cellae, the last dural fold, that is diaphragma cellae. Okay. So here, can you see this one? So this is our, I'm writing as DS, don't have a space here. That is a diaphragma cellae. DS means diaphragma cellae. See, diaphragma cellae is present over the sella turcica. Yes, the body of sphenoid. Yes, you have the saddle shaped space, and that is called sella turcica. It is present over the sella turcica, and that forms the roof of pituitary gland. Roof of pituitary gland. Okay, right. So these are the four dural folds we have. What are those? Falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, tentorium cerebelli, and diaphragma cellae. Okay, right. Now we're going to start the discussion about the dural venous sinus. Dural venous sinus definition already we know. So now we have the paired and the unpaired dural venous sinus. Okay, so we have paired and the unpaired venous sinus. In the diagram, yes, we are seeing the unpaired venous sinus. Now the unpaired venous sinuses, number 1, superior sagittal sinus. Number 2, inferior sagittal sinus. Number 3, straight sinus. And number 4, occipital sinus. Number 5, posterior and anterior intercavernous sinus. And number 6, basilar venous plexus. This one, that is basilar venous plexus. So these are the unpaired venous sinuses we have. Okay, what are those? Superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, posterior and anterior intercavernous sinus, basilar venous plexus, and occipital sinus. So the mnemonic is sister is working in BPO. Sister is working in call center. That is a mnemonic. Remember the unpaired venous sinus. Okay. Now what are all the paired venous sinus? Now the paired venous sinuses. Number 1, cavernous sinus. Cavernous sinus present on either side of the body of the sphenoid. So cavernous sinus. Okay. So next one, Petrous temporal bone is present on either side. Okay, Petrous temporal bone. So above and below the Petrous temporal bone, we have superior and inferior petrosal sinus. So superior and inferior petrosal sinus. Okay. And then the transverse sinus, this one, transverse sinus, paired sinus on either side. And then transverse sinus, which in turn continue as sigmoid sinus. This one, sigmoid sinus. Okay. And then your spinopalatal sinus, petrosquamous sinus, and middle meningeal vein. So these are the paired venous sinus. Okay. So the exams, they may ask you all the following are the paired venous sinus except which are the following is not the unpaired venous sinus. Likewise, they may ask you. Okay. Right. Now we're going to see the fate of these sinuses. Now see the diagram. Now what is the fate of these dural venous sinus? It's actually one sinus only going to continue as other sinus. So which sinus continues with sinus? That is what we're going to see now. Now the superior sagittal sinus, which in turn continue as the right transverse sinus. So superior sagittal sinus, which in turn continue as right transverse sinus. Okay, this is one. Next one, our inferior sagittal sinus, which in turn continue as straight sinus. Okay, now the straight sinus which receives Gallen's vein, great cerebral vein of Gallen. After receiving that, which in turn continue as left transverse sinus. Okay, so please write inferior sagittal sinus, which continue as straight sinus, and the straight sinus which receives the great cerebral vein of Gallen, that is Gallen's vein. After receiving the Gallen's vein, which in turn continue as left transverse sinus. Okay. So now the transverse sinus, which in turn continue as the sigmoid sinus. So both transverse sinus, right and left transverse sinus, which in turn continue as sigmoid sinus. So transverse sinus, which in turn continue as a sigmoid sinus, and the sigmoid sinus, which in turn continue as an internal jugular vein, passes through internal jugular foramen and in turn continue as an internal jugular vein. Okay, right. Now one more thing we're going to see, the formation of basilar venous plexus. See, basilar venous plexus is coming from, see the diagram. Now I'm going to zoom this image so that you get a clear picture of the basilar venous plexus. So now you have to know the formation of basilar venous plexus. See, basilar venous plexus is coming from three sources. Basilar venous plexus is coming from three sources. I'm going to mark here. Now, can you see the cavernous sinus here? Cavernous sinus will be here like this. So, basilar venous plexus is coming from, number 1, cavernous sinus will give the contribution. And number 2, now this is inferior petrosal sinus. And this one, posterior intercavernous sinus. Actually, this is anterior intercavernous sinus. And number 3, what I marked there is a posterior intercavernous sinus. So, number 1, please write. Basilar venous plexus is formed by the union of cavernous sinus. Okay. Number 2, inferior petrosal sinus. Inferior petrosal sinus. And number 3, posterior intercavernous sinus. Posterior intercavernous sinus. Okay. So, these 3 venous sinuses, they join together and they give a contribution to basilar venous plexus. Now, basilar venous plexus, this is a foramen magnum, which is foramen magnum. This is present just in front of the foramen magnum, and the basilar venous plexus, which in turn continue as a vertebral venous plexus. So, it is the venous sinus, which in turn continue as the vertebral venous plexus. Vertebral venous plexus. Okay. So, it's all about the basilar venous plexus. And one more point. Now here, the 4 sinuses will meet here. And that meeting point is called the confluence of sinus. So confluence of sinus means meeting point of 4 sinus. What are sinuses meeting here? See here, I'm going to mark this. Number 1, superior sagittal is meeting here. Superior sagittal, number 1. Okay. Number 2, straight sinus here. And number 3, occipital sinus. And number 4, transverse sinus. So 4 sinuses meet at one point, and that meeting point is called confluence of sinus. Okay. So please write confluence of sinus. So confluence of sinus, it is a meeting point of 4 sinus. Mnemonic is TOSS. TOS is a mnemonic. So T, transverse sinus. O, occipital sinus. S, superior sagittal sinus. Another S, straight sinus. So these are the sinuses. They meet at the confluence of sinus. Okay. So that's all about the dural venous sinus. Now we're going to see in detail about the cavernous sinus. So now what is the location of the cavernous sinus? So, cavernous sinus is present on either side of the body of the sphenoid bone. Now see the diagram. Now this is superior view, and this is the lesser wing of sphenoid, and this is the greater wing of sphenoid, and this is the body of the sphenoid. So B is the body of the sphenoid. Now cavernous sinus is present on either side of body of the sphenoid. Okay, so cavernous sinus is present on either side of body of the sphenoid. On either side of body of the sphenoid. Okay, that's the location of cavernous sinus. So now we're going to take a section. We're going to cut in this plane. So if you take a section in this plane, we're going to cut the bone in that plane, then you get a diagram like this. Okay, this is a cavernous sinus. Now medially, yes, we are seeing this bone. What bone? So medial to the cavernous sinus, this is a cavernous sinus. Now middle to cavernous sinus, you are seeing this bone. What bone? Sphenoid bone. Now inside the sphenoid bone, we have a space. That space is filled with air. So these spaces are called sphenoidal sinus. So medially, we have sphenoidal sinus, and above the sphenoidal sinus, we have gland. Which gland? Pituitary gland. Pituitary gland. Okay. So middle to the cavernous sinus, we have sphenoidal sinus and the pituitary gland. Okay. Right. Now lateral to the cavernous sinus, actually it is not marked in the diagram. We have trigeminal ganglion. I'm writing TG here. Trigeminal ganglion will be here only. The trigeminal ganglion will be here like this. That's a trigeminal ganglion. Okay, in the Meckel's cave. So lateral to the cavernous sinus, we have trigeminal ganglion. Lateral to the cavernous sinus, see, many relations are there. I'm telling certain important relations only. Okay. So lateral to the cavernous sinus, we have trigeminal ganglion. Okay. Now, what are the structures passing through the cavernous sinus? Now we have 2 structures passes through cavernous sinus. What are those? Our internal carotid artery, and below lateral to internal carotid artery, we are seeing 6th nerve. Which nerve? Abducent nerve. So structures passing through the cavernous sinus. So through the cavernous sinus, structures passing through the cavernous sinus. 2 structures. What are those? Internal carotid artery and abducent nerve. Okay. Now in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, we have oculomotor nerve, okay, trochlear nerve, and ophthalmic branch of trigeminal nerve. Now please strike out the maxillary nerve of trigeminal nerve. Maxillary nerve, as per the recent edition Grace, it is not passing in the lateral wall. But in the ENT books, still they are saying maxillary nerve is running in the lateral wall. So now we're going to write structures in the lateral wall. Maxillary nerve we're going to add as plus or minus option. Okay. Now the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, we have number 1, oculomotor nerve. Number 2, trochlear nerve. Number 3, ophthalmic nerve. Ophthalmic nerve. So please remember the maxillary nerve. Maxillary nerve as a plus or minus option in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. Depending upon the other options, you have to select the answer. Okay. So maxillary nerve, put one box. It is not passing in lateral wall. Not passing in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. Okay. From 2016, 41st edition Grace, they were saying the same thing only. Okay. Right. These are structures in the lateral wall. Next, we're going to see tributaries of the cavernous sinus. Now, what are the veins? They drain into the cavernous sinus. So, tributaries are called inflow channels. There are some veins, they drain into the cavernous sinus. The tributaries of the cavernous sinus. Okay. So, now we're going to zoom this image and we're going to see the tributaries of the cavernous sinus. So, now we zoom this image and see the diagram. Now, this is our cavernous sinus. I told you, tributaries are the inflow channels. They drain into the cavernous sinus. Now we have 3 veins from the orbit. So please write the heading tributaries. And we have 3 veins from the orbit. So from orbit and the eyeball. 3 veins, they drain into the cavernous sinus. Number 1, superior ophthalmic vein, this one. Number 2, similarly below, inferior ophthalmic vein will be there. And number 3, central vein of retina. That is our central vein of retina. Okay, so from the orbit and eyeball, we have superior ophthalmic vein. Number 2, inferior ophthalmic vein. And central vein of retina. Central vein of retina. Okay. Now from the brain, we have 2, superficial middle cerebral vein and inferior cerebral vein. So from the brain, we have from the cerebrum, superficial middle cerebral vein, superficial middle cerebral vein and inferior cerebral vein. Inferior cerebral vein. Okay. Now from meninges, see from meninges, now we have to see diagram. Now this is our spinoparietal sinus. They drain into the cavernous sinus and middle meningeal vein drain into cavernous sinus. Okay. So spinoparietal sinus from the meninges. So from the meninges, spinoparietal sinus and number 2, middle meningeal vein. Middle meningeal vein. So these are the tributaries of the cavernous sinus. Okay. So what are those? From the orbit and eyeball, superior ophthalmic vein, inferior ophthalmic vein, central vein of retina. From the brain, superficial middle cerebral vein, inferior cerebral vein, and from the meninges, spinoparietal sinus and middle meningeal vein. Clear? Right. So these are the tributaries. Now, why you have to know the tributaries? So if you know the tributaries, if there is any infection in the cavernous sinus, then the thrombus may go to these veins. So from the cavernous sinus, infection may go to orbit and eyeball. From the cavernous sinus, infection may go to cavernous sinus. And from there, cavernous sinus, the infection may go to meninges. Okay. Next one. We have communicating channels. See, these communicating channels, they communicate the cavernous sinus to the other sinus. I told you tributaries are the inflow channels. We have communicating channels. These are called outflow channels. Okay. So now we're going to write the communicating channels for the cavernous sinus. Communicating channels. Communicating channels. So communicating channels are the outflow channels. Okay. They communicate cavernous sinus to the other sinus. Fine. Next one. See the diagram. I am marking this one as number 1. There is a superior petrosal sinus in the superior part of petrous temporal bone, which is connecting the cavernous sinus here to the transverse sinus. This is transverse sinus. So cavernous sinus and transverse sinus are connected by superior petrosal sinus. Okay, sir. What about inferior petrosal sinus? See the diagram. Now this is inferior petrosal sinus, this one. See, inferior petrosal sinus is going through this foramen. What foramen? That is the jugular foramen. Now in the posterior part of jugular foramen, yes, we are also seeing the sigmoid sinus is going and continues the internal jugular vein. So this inferior petrosal sinus coming from the cavernous sinus, connecting the cavernous sinus to internal jugular vein. The sigmoid sinus, after coming out of jugular foramen, which will be called as internal jugular vein, now this inferior petrosal sinus joins with the internal jugular vein. Okay, so now communicating channels. So till now we have seen two. So cavernous sinus, which is communicating with transverse sinus via superior petrosal sinus. Next one, the cavernous sinus, which communicate with internal jugular vein via inferior petrosal sinus. So inferior petrosal sinus passes through jugular foramen, and the sigmoid sinus, which in turn continues internal jugular vein, again through posterior part of jugular foramen only. So this inferior petrosal sinus, which in turn joins with internal jugular vein. Okay. Next, see the diagram. Now cavernous sinus of two sides, they are communicating with each other through intercavernous sinus. See here, this one and this one. So cavernous sinus of two sides, communicate via anterior and posterior intercavernous sinus. So this is very important. Why, sir? So cavernous sinus of two sides, they are communicating freely with each other. So any infection in any one of the cavernous sinus, the infection easily go to the other side. Okay. So please write, put one box. So cavernous sinus of two sides communicate via anterior and post intercavernous sinus. So cavernous sinus thrombosis. So any infection in any one of the cavernous sinus, the infection easily go to the other side. So cavernous sinus thrombosis always present as bilateral condition. Always present as a bilateral condition. Why? Because we have communication. Because of anterior and posterior intracavernous sinus. Clear? Right. Now we also have a communication between the cavernous sinus and the facial vein. Facial vein and cavernous sinus, they communicate with each other via two channels. Now see number one. Now this is the facial vein. See, facial vein is nothing but continuation of angular vein. Now from the angular vein via superior ophthalmic vein, we have a connection to cavernous sinus. So first communication is from facial vein, angular vein. Now from angular vein to the superior ophthalmic vein. So from superior ophthalmic vein to cavernous sinus. This is one route. Okay. Now we have one more route from facial vein. This is deep facial vein. So from deep facial vein via it reaches the pterygoid venous plexus. From pterygoid venous plexus via emissary veins. This is emissary veins. I am writing EV here. Via emissary veins, it may reach the cavernous sinus. Okay. So the another route is second route, facial vein, and then deep facial vein. So from deep facial vein, the fibers are given to pterygoid venous plexus. So from pterygoid venous plexus via emissary vein to the cavernous sinus. So facial vein and the cavernous sinus, they are communicating with each other via deep facial vein and superior ophthalmic vein. So we have two veins. We have two channels which are communicating the facial vein to the cavernous sinus. The exam they will ask you what is the best channel? Facial vein most commonly communicate to the cavernous sinus via superior ophthalmic, this vein only. Okay. So now please put on box and then write facial vein facial vein communicates with cavernous sinus most commonly through superior ophthalmic vein greater than the deep facial vein. Okay. So facial vein communicate to the cavernous sinus. So now any infection in the area drained by the facial vein, the infection easily go to the cavernous sinus, and that is why yes we have the danger area of the face. So what is the danger area of the face? I told you in the face topic itself. Now danger area of the face is the area between the nose and the upper lip. Why? Because this area is drained by facial vein. So just now I told you facial vein communicate with the cavernous sinus. So any infection in this area, the infection spread in retrograde fashion, which in turn result in thrombosis of the cavernous sinus. I told you already in the face module, but again the reason is this one only. The communication is yes, just now we have seen between the facial vein and the cavernous sinus. That's all about the cavernous sinus. Okay, and see almost we come to the end of the module. So only two things are pending. We have to know the nerve supply and the arterial supply of the dura mater. Okay, so now we're going to take two bones, the lesser wing of sphenoid, that is the lesser wing of sphenoid, and this is the superior border of the petrous temporal bone. Superior border of petrous temporal bone. So now up to lesser wing of sphenoid, the cranial fossa is called anterior cranial fossa. From the lesser wing of sphenoid up to superior border of petrous temporal bone, it is called middle cranial fossa. And behind the petrous temporal bone is the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, now we're going to draw the line diagram. Okay, so now this is our anterior cranial fossa, and this is our middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, so this is anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. The posterior cranial fossa you are seeing foramen magnum here. Right. Now the anterior cranial fossa is supplied by here anterior and posterior ethmoidal foramen will be here. So through these foramens, anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve, anterior ethmoidal nerve and posterior ethmoidal nerve. The meningeal branches from anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve. Again, meningeal branches from the ethmoidal nerve. Ethmoidal nerve is a branch of ophthalmic nerve. Ophthalmic nerve is a branch of trigeminal first division. Ophthalmic nerve. So ophthalmic nerve supplies the anterior cranial fossa via anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve. Okay, right. Now in the middle cranial fossa, we have two foramens. One is foramen rotundum and another one foramen ovale. So foramen rotundum transmit maxillary nerve. So now maxillary nerve supplies the middle cranial fossa, that is trigeminal second division maxillary nerve. Now this maxillary nerve also give a branch to the anterior cranial fossa like this. Okay, so anterior cranial fossa is also supplied by trigeminal second division. Now foramen ovale transmit mandibular nerve. So from foramen ovale, the mandibular nerve will come. Okay, now this mandibular nerve gives meningeal branch. Now the meningeal branch of mandibular nerve supplies the middle cranial fossa. So middle cranial fossa is also supplied by the meningeal branch from the mandibular nerve. Okay, mandibular nerve. Okay, now this mandibular nerve again also supplies anterior cranial fossa. So anterior cranial fossa also supplied by the meningeal branch from the mandibular nerve. Okay, so now we completed the nerve supply of the anterior cranial fossa. So the anterior cranial fossa is supplied by all the three subdivisions of the trigeminal nerve. Anterior meningeal branch from anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve, branch of ophthalmic nerve, meningeal branch from the maxillary nerve, meningeal branch from the mandibular nerve. So trigeminal nerve, all the three subdivisions supply the anterior cranial fossa. Okay. Now what about the middle cranial fossa? Middle cranial fossa is supplied by meningeal branch from maxillary and mandibular. 5-2 and 5-3. Okay. Right. So what about the posterior cranial fossa? Now in this diagram, yes, we are seeing the anterior cranial fossa supplied by anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerve meningeal branch, the maxillary branch meningeal branch, and mandibular nerve meningeal branch. So all the three will supply the anterior cranial fossa. Anterior cranial fossa supplied by 5-1, 5-2, 5-3. Right. What about the middle cranial fossa, which is supplied by the meningeal branches from maxillary nerve and mandibular nerve? So middle cranial fossa supplied by 5-2 and 5-3, maxillary and mandibular alone. Now the posterior cranial fossa is supplied by, see here, now the ophthalmic nerve give tentorial branch. The tentorial branch of ophthalmic nerve come all the way to the posterior cranial fossa and supply the dura of the posterior cranial fossa, number 1. The posterior cranial fossa is also supplied by C1 fibers via hypoglossal nerve, okay, and C2 and C3 fibers via vagus nerve. So posterior cranial fossa is supplied by tentorial branch from ophthalmic nerve, the C1 fibers via hypoglossal nerve, and C2, C3 fibers via vagus nerve. Okay. Now this is about the nerve supply of dura. Next, we're going to see arterial supply of dura. Again, we're going to draw the line diagram. So arterial supply of dura. Again, this is the anterior cranial fossa. This is middle cranial fossa, and this is posterior cranial fossa. Right. So anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. Posterior cranial fossa is having foramen magnum. Yes. Now anterior cranial fossa, I told you already, we have anterior and the posterior ethmoidal foramen, which transmit anterior ethmoidal artery and the posterior ethmoidal artery. So anterior cranial fossa, the arterial supply by anterior and posterior ethmoidal artery. Now anterior and posterior ethmoidal artery are the branches of ophthalmic artery. Now ophthalmic artery is a branch of internal carotid. Very good. So anterior and posterior ethmoidal artery, they are the branches of ophthalmic artery, and ophthalmic artery which in turn a branch of internal carotid. Okay, sir. Now in the middle cranial fossa, we have foramen ovale and foramen spinosum. Foramen ovale and foramen spinosum. Now foramen ovale I am writing as FO and this is FS. Now foramen ovale transmit accessory middle meningeal artery. This is accessory middle meningeal artery, and foramen spinosum transmit middle meningeal artery. Okay. So now middle cranial fossa is supplied by accessory middle meningeal artery, accessory middle meningeal artery, okay, and middle meningeal artery, and middle meningeal artery. Okay. Now accessory middle meningeal artery passes through foramen ovale. I am writing as written as A now, that is the accessory middle meningeal artery, and MMA means middle meningeal artery. So accessory middle meningeal artery, they are the branches of maxillary artery. Now maxillary artery is a branch of external carotid artery. Now see the diagram. In the diagram, I have drawn the middle meningeal artery also to the anterior cranial fossa. That means anterior cranial fossa is also supplied by middle meningeal artery. So anterior cranial fossa is also supplied by middle meningeal artery. Just now I told you, middle meningeal artery, branch of maxillary. Maxillary is a branch of external carotid. So anterior cranial fossa is supplied by both internal carotid artery branch and the external carotid artery branch. So anterior cranial fossa supplied by anterior and posterior ethmoidal artery and middle meningeal artery. Clear? Right. Now what about the middle cranial fossa? Middle cranial fossa, accessory middle meningeal artery and middle meningeal artery, branch of external carotid. Now on either side of body of the sphenoid bone, we have a cavernous sinus. I am drawing cavernous sinus on only one side. Now the cavernous sinus, through cavernous sinus, one artery is passing. Which artery? Internal carotid artery is passing. So internal carotid artery, yes, also gives a meningeal branch, supplies the dura of the middle cranial fossa. So internal carotid artery also giving a branch, direct branch, internal carotid artery. Okay. From the cavernous sinus, yes, the internal carotid artery gives meningeal branch, which supplies the dura of middle cranial fossa. Meningeal branch, which supplies the dura of middle cranial fossa. Okay. So middle cranial fossa is supplied again by both external carotid and internal carotid. What are the external carotid artery branch supplying the middle cranial fossa? Accessory middle meningeal and middle meningeal. And middle cranial fossa also supplied by direct branches from internal carotid. The cavernous part of internal carotid gives meningeal branch. Okay. Right. Now, what about the posterior cranial fossa? Now, the posterior cranial fossa is supplied by occipital artery, and foramen magnum, the vertebral artery is passing, no? Yes, the fourth part of vertebral artery passes through foramen magnum. Yes, that gives meningeal branch. So, posterior cranial fossa is supplied by the meningeal branches from vertebral artery, meningeal branch from vertebral artery, and also occipital artery. Okay. Right. Now, one last point, please put one box, that is meningeal branch from the ascending pharyngeal artery. Meningeal branch from the ascending pharyngeal artery. Ascending pharyngeal artery supplies both middle cranial fossa and the posterior cranial fossa. That's all. Again, we don't have any other foramens there, so we write at the last. So, meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery supplies both middle cranial fossa and posterior cranial fossa. Okay, right. So now we're going to sum up and we're going to say the blood supply of dura mater. So anterior cranial fossa is supplied by anterior ethmoidal artery, posterior ethmoidal artery, and middle meningeal artery. Anterior cranial fossa supplied by both external carotid and internal carotid. Fine. Middle cranial fossa is supplied by accessory middle meningeal artery, internal carotid artery direct branch, and the meningeal branches from ascending pharyngeal. Now posterior cranial fossa is supplied by the meningeal branch from ascending pharyngeal, the meningeal branch from vertebral artery, and the meningeal branches from the occipital artery. Okay. Now we're going to see the animations for the dural venous sinus. Now see here, this is our superior sagittal sinus, which is continuing as, see there, that is our right transverse sinus. Right. Now this is our inferior sagittal sinus. Now these are the basal veins uniting with internal cerebral vein, and they in turn forms the, yes, that is our great cerebral vein of Galen. The basal veins and the internal cerebral vein unite together to form great cerebral vein of Galen. Now the great cerebral vein of Galen joining with inferior sagittal sinus and then forms straight sinus. That is the straight sinus there. Okay. Now the straight sinus, which in turn continue as, very good, our left transverse sinus. The straight sinus, which in turn continue as this one only. That is the left transverse sinus. Now the left transverse sinus, which in turn continue as sigmoid sinus. See there? And the sigmoid sinus, which in turn passes through jugular foramen and then continue as the internal jugular vein. Yes, very good. Now we're going to see the cavernous sinus. Now this is a cavernous sinus. Yes, that is present on either side of body of the sphenoid bone. Okay, right. Now we're going to see the connections of the cavernous sinus, communicating channel. Now the cavernous sinus communicating the transverse sinus via this vein. Now that vein is passing above the petrous part of temporal bone. This is a petrous part of temporal bone. So the vein is passing above the petrous part of temporal bone, and that is called as superior petrosal sinus. Connect the cavernous sinus to the transverse sinus. Okay. Now similarly, we have inferior petrosal sinus. Connect the cavernous sinus to the internal jugular vein. Superior and inferior petrosal sinus. Please don't forget this. Okay. Now we are seeing the relations of the cavernous sinus in the lateral wall. Now in the lateral wall, we are seeing the third nerve there. This is the third nerve. Just below that, that is the fourth nerve. And just below that, that is the ophthalmic branch of trigeminal. Okay. Please remember the maxillary nerve, that is the maxillary nerve for the trigeminal ganglion, that is not passing in the lateral wall as per the recent edition Grace. The maxillary nerve is running in the floor of the cavernous sinus. And we're going to see the foramen, that is our foramen rotundum, the round foramen through which the maxillary nerve is passing. See there? That is the, yes, foramen rotundum, the round foramen we are seeing there. Foramen rotundum. Okay? The foramen rotundum. Right. Now, next one, we're going to see structures passing through the cavernous sinus. This is a cavernous sinus. Two structures are passing through the cavernous sinus. What are those? Now that is our, very good, our abducent nerve is passing through the cavernous sinus. Abducent nerve. And one more artery, that is our internal carotid artery. See, internal carotid artery and the abducent nerve, the two structures passing through the cavernous sinus. Okay. Now we remove the cavernous sinus. We remove the sinus so that you can see the course of the internal carotid artery here. See here, the internal carotid artery is going like this. Okay, and this is our abducent nerve. So these two structures are passing through the cavernous sinus. These are the things you have to know in the animation of the dural venous sinus topic. And by this, we are completing the dural fold and the dural venous sinus.